October 21, 1944, Philippine Sea. The American fleet moved through water that seemed deceptively calm. 4 Japanese aircraft were approaching from the west. To the radar operators aboard USS St. a light escort carrier, the contacts seemed routine. Enemy fighters attempting a probe. The ship's anti-aircraft batteries had handled hundreds of such attacks. The systems were designed for enemies who wanted to survive. The systems were about to encounter enemies who did not. Admiral Takijiro Onishi stood in his headquarters on Mabalacat Air Base in the Philippines. Onishi was 56 years old. He had spent his entire life in the Japanese military. He had seen the empire expand. He had watched it begin to contract. By October 1944, Onishi understood what others in Japanese military command were still reluctant to acknowledge. Japan was losing. The American fleet was too large. American production was too great. American pilots were increasingly trained. The war, viewed rationally, was already over. What remained was merely the duration of the ending. But Onishi was a man who thought in different terms than rationality. Onishi understood honor. Onishi understood sacrifice. Onishi understood that when conventional warfare had failed, when strategy had failed, when technology had failed, there remained one final option. A man willing to give his life for his country. A man who would not attempt to escape. A man who would not attempt to survive. A man who would crash his aircraft into an enemy ship, taking as many enemies with him as possible in the process. Onishi had been searching for a tactic that could disrupt American naval operations. American ships were too well defended for conventional air attacks. American fighters were too numerous. American anti-aircraft systems were too effective. But what if the defenders were not defending against pilots who wanted to live? What if the anti-aircraft crews encountered pilots who had already accepted death? Captain Robert Knott stood on the bridge of USS St. Knott was 32 years old. He had been in the Navy since 1939. He had survived battles in the Pacific. He had seen what Japanese aircraft could do when piloted by skilled flyers. But the Japanese had few skilled flyers left. Most were dead. What remained were pilots hastily trained, desperately equipped, flying against an enemy with overwhelming numerical superiority. Knott expected Japanese aircraft to attempt attacks. He expected his anti-aircraft defenses to handle the attacks. He did not expect what was about to happen. Major Masaru Yasui sat in the operations room with his pilots. Yasui had volunteered for this assignment. Yasui had been selected by Onishi himself. Yasui's job was to create a unit of pilots willing to die, a unit that would accept one-way missions, a unit that understood that their purpose was not to return. Their purpose was to crash into enemy ships and destroy them. Yasui looked at the faces of his pilots. Some were old, men who had flown dozens of combat missions. Some were young, barely out of flight school. All of them had volunteered. All of them had understood what volunteering meant. Yasui had expected resistance. He had expected moral hesitation. Instead, he had encountered something more complicated. He had encountered desperation. The pilots knew Japan was losing. They knew conventional tactics were failing. Some seemed to embrace the kamikaze concept as a final way to matter. Others seemed to accept it as inevitable. A few, Yasui could see it in their eyes, were terrified, but would not admit it. The 4 aircraft lifted off at dawn on October 21st. They carried bombs. They had practiced approaches. Onishi had personally explained the operation. This was not chaos. This was not insanity. This was military operation. This was an alternative to conventional warfare. This was what you did when you had no other choices remaining. The 4 aircraft flew toward the American fleet. Inside USS St. Combat Information Center, radar operators watched the blips approach. The contacts moved in a way that seemed consistent with previous Japanese aircraft behavior. The operators reported the approach. The captain received the information. Anti-aircraft crews manned their positions. Sailors took protective stations. Everything was ready. Everything was prepared. All the systems designed for enemies who wanted to survive were activated and ready. What happened next would be recorded in ship logs with the cold precision of military documentation. 0 fighters approached from astern. Anti-aircraft fire engaged. 1 aircraft destroyed at long range. 2nd aircraft hit and damaged. 3rd aircraft descended despite damage and struck the bridge structure. 4th aircraft struck the flight deck. But the logs could not capture what the men on USS St. experienced. The first 2 aircraft were conventional attacks. Anti-aircraft fire worked. The pilots, seeing the intensity of defensive fire, attempted to maneuver. They attempted to evade. But maneuver requires pilot reaction time, and reaction time assumes the pilot wants to survive. The 3rd aircraft did not maneuver. The 3rd aircraft flew straight into the defensive fire. It was hit. Pieces fell from its fuselage. Its control surfaces were damaged, but it kept flying. It kept descending. It crashed directly into the bridge of USS St. The explosion was catastrophic. The Kamikaze aircraft detonated on impact. Fire engulfed the bridge structure. Officers died instantly. The captain was killed. The ship suffered structural damage that was far more severe than a conventional bomb strike would have produced. Because this was not a bomb that arrived on a trajectory and exploded. This was a pilot who had aimed himself at the ship and detonated his entire aircraft upon impact. Captain Knott, the fictional representation of American commanders who would face kamikaze attacks, would later record his thoughts about what happened on USS St. "We shot down 2. We damaged 1 so severely it should have crashed into the ocean. Instead, it crashed into our ship. The 3rd one came straight at us. No evasion, no attempt to survive. Just a straight line toward our position. Every system we have is designed around the assumption that pilots want to live, that pilots will attempt to escape. This pilot was not attempting to escape. This pilot was attempting to crash. How do you defend against that?" By noon on October 21st, USS St. was sinking. The ship that had survived months of combat was destroyed in minutes by pilots willing to die. Back at Mabalakot Air Base, Onishi received the report. The operation was successful. The American ship was sunk. The 4 pilots were dead, but the operation had worked. For the first time, Japan had a tactic that the Americans did not have a ready answer for. Yasui, standing in the operations room as the reports came in, felt something complicated. Pride in the pilots who had followed his orders, shame that those pilots were now dead. Understanding that this was the beginning of something that had no natural ending. That if this tactic worked once, it would be repeated. That pilots would continue to volunteer, or would be ordered. That death would become the primary strategy of the Imperial Japanese Navy. In that moment, on October 21st, 1944, the nature of warfare shifted. Not fundamentally, humans had always been willing to die, but systematically, officially, organizationally. Japan now had a weapon that traditional anti-aircraft defenses could not defeat. Pilots who did not care if they lived or died, because their survival had already been written off as irrelevant to mission success. The mathematics of kamikaze were undeniable. A conventional aircraft attack against a warship had approximately 40 to 50% probability of causing damage. This percentage assumed conventional combat. The pilot attempting to evade defensive fire, to maneuver, to improve targeting solution, to escape. The mathematical expectation was that most attacking aircraft would be destroyed without reaching the target. Of those reaching the target, most would miss. Of those hitting the target, most would cause limited damage. Kamikaze inverted this mathematics. A kamikaze pilot had approximately 80 to 90% probability of reaching the target. Because the pilot was not attempting to evade. Because the pilot was not maneuvering. Because the entire purpose was to reach the target, not to escape. The defensive systems that were calibrated for enemies attempting to survive became inefficient against enemies who were not attempting to survive. The economics of kamikaze were equally compelling. A Zero fighter cost approximately $50,000 in 1944 currency. A pilot required years of training. The economic cost of producing a Zero and training a pilot to operate it was substantial, but the return on this investment had diminished over the course of the war. By 1944, with American production overwhelming Japanese production, the economic calculation had reversed. A Zero with a trained pilot had low probability of achieving significant damage against American forces before being destroyed. But the same Zero and pilot, used as a kamikaze, had high probability of destroying an American ship worth substantially more than $50,000. Captain Robert Knott, analyzing the destruction of USS St. understood the mathematical and economic implications. One aircraft had destroyed a 30,000-ton escort carrier. The aircraft cost approximately $50,000. The ship cost approximately $20 million. The ratio was catastrophically unfavorable for the United States. If Japan could maintain a ratio of one aircraft destroying one American ship, Japan could attrition American naval power faster than American production could replace the losses. But Knott also understood something the pure mathematics missed. The mathematics assumed a system that was static. The Americans would adapt. The Americans would develop new defensive tactics. The Americans would allocate resources toward defending against kamikaze attacks specifically. The initial mathematics advantage would degrade as the Americans responded. The question was whether Japan could deliver sufficient kamikaze strikes before American adaptation rendered the tactic ineffective. Admiral Onishi understood this timeline as well. He knew that Japan had perhaps months, maybe weeks, before American adaptation would reduce kamikaze effectiveness. The window was narrow. The operation had to be scaled immediately. Onishi issued orders to expand the kamikaze program. Instead of 4 pilots, there would be dozens. Instead of one attack, there would be waves. Instead of experimental tactic, there would be systematic strategy. The pilots who volunteered, or who were ordered, for kamikaze operations came from different backgrounds. Some were experienced flyers who saw the suicide mission as a final way to matter. Some were barely trained replacements who saw no alternative. Some were drafted into the program and given no choice. Yasui's job was to prepare them. Yasui's job was to create an organizational structure for suicide. Yasui began organizing the Kamikaze Special Attack Corps. He divided pilots into units. Each unit had a name suggesting spiritual purpose. Yamato Spirit, Divine Wind, Cherry Blossom. The names were designed to elevate suicide into something transcendent, something honorable, something that made sense within the framework of Japanese military culture. But Yasui knew the psychological reality behind the names. These pilots were not volunteering for transcendence. They were volunteering for death, because the alternative was even worse. Yasui held meetings with his pilots. He explained the mission. He explained that each pilot would be given a one-way ticket, that each pilot would be equipped with an aircraft loaded with explosives, that each pilot would fly toward American ships and crash directly into them. He explained that survival was not the goal, that the goal was maximum damage to the enemy, that the goal was honor in service to the emperor, that the goal was to demonstrate Japanese resolve in the face of inevitable defeat. What Yasui observed in his pilots' reactions varied from man to man. Some seemed to accept the assignment with philosophical resignation. Others seemed to embrace it with what looked like enthusiasm, though Yasui suspected the enthusiasm masked deeper psychological disturbance. A few seemed simply terrified. One pilot, a 20-year-old named Mitsubishi, who had only 30 hours of flight time, asked Yasui if there was any possibility the assignment could be modified. Yasui told him no. The assignment was final. The mission was set. The pilot would perform his duty. Mitsubishi accepted this with the formal politeness of Japanese military culture. But Yasui saw something break behind Mitsubishi's eyes. Yasui saw the psychological moment when a man accepted that he would die soon, that nothing he could do would change this outcome, that his only choice was how to face that death. The American Navy, reacting to the loss of USS St. and subsequent Kamikaze attacks, began implementing countermeasures. New defensive tactics were developed. Anti-aircraft batteries were reorganized. The concentration of fire was increased. Radar systems were modified to identify kamikaze aircraft earlier. Combat air patrols were increased to intercept kamikaze attacks before reaching the fleet. The mathematics of kamikaze efficacy began to change as American adaptation proceeded. But the adaptation was incomplete. American systems were still designed around defending against pilots who wanted to live. Even with improvements, even with concentration of fire, even with earlier interception, kamikaze aircraft still penetrated American defenses. They still reached targets. They still caused damage. The percentage of kamikaze aircraft destroyed before reaching targets increased, but it never approached 100%. By November 1944, kamikaze attacks had become systematic. Waves of attacks occurred regularly. American ships continued to be damaged or destroyed. American sailors began to understand that they were facing something qualitatively different than conventional combat. This was not combat, where an opponent was attempting to kill you while preserving their own life. This was combat where the opponent had already accepted their own death and was simply trying to maximize damage in the process. The psychological impact on American crews was profound. Conventional naval warfare had protocols, conventions. An enemy attacked, you defended. You tried to survive. The enemy tried to survive. Everyone had incentive to preserve life. But kamikaze pilots had already surrendered the incentive to preserve life. This made them, in some fundamental sense, invulnerable to psychological pressure. You could threaten them with death, but they were already accepting death. You could try to convince them to surrender, but surrender meant death anyway. Yasui, overseeing the expansion of the kamikaze program, faced a moral question he could not escape. He was sending young men to die, men who had volunteered in many cases, but also men who had been ordered, men who feared death, but who would comply with military command structure, men who, in another era, in another nation, would have been students, or farmers, or shopkeepers. Instead, they were being prepared to crash aircraft into enemy ships. Yasui attended the final briefings before missions. He watched pilots receive ceremonial haircuts. He watched them write final letters to families they would never see again. He watched them consume ritual meals. He watched them perform religious ceremonies. He watched all the rituals that Japanese military culture had constructed to transform suicide into something spiritually meaningful. And Yasui wondered if the rituals changed what was occurring. If the spiritual framing changed the fundamental reality that young men were being sent to die, and that this was happening because Japan was losing and Onishi had decided that losing soldiers was better than losing ships. The statistics accumulated through November and into December 1944. 30 kamikaze attacks resulted in 5 ships sunk and 15 damaged. 50 attacks resulted in 8 ships sunk and 20 damaged. By December, Nearly 100 pilots had been expended. The attrition rate of both pilots and ships was unsustainable for both sides, but Japan was running out of pilots faster than the United States was running out of ships. The mathematical advantage Kamikaze had possessed in October was evaporating by December. American adaptation was working, but working slowly. Slowly enough that many ships would still be damaged and many sailors would still be killed before the American defenses reached full effectiveness. November 1944. The waves of kamikaze attacks accelerated. What had begun as experimental operation became systematic devastation. Every day brought new attacks. Every attack brought new casualties. The American Navy was experiencing something it had never encountered, an enemy tactic that was mathematically superior to its defensive systems. The Americans were adapting, but adaptation required time. And time was the one resource Japan had least available. Admiral Onishi observed the progress of his Special Attack Corps with grim satisfaction. The tactic was working. American ships continued to be damaged or destroyed. The psychological impact on American sailors was profound. But Onishi also observed something else. The rate of volunteer pilots was declining. The initial pool of men willing to crash their aircraft into enemy ships was being depleted. Onishi began ordering pilots to participate in kamikaze missions. Willingness was no longer a prerequisite. Orders were sufficient. This created a new problem for Major Yasui. Some of his pilots had volunteered, but increasingly, pilots were assigned to kamikaze units without their consent. They were given orders. They were expected to obey. Yasui had to maintain unit cohesion and operational effectiveness while managing men who were being forced to participate in suicide missions. Some pilots accepted their fate with stoic resignation. Others became depressed, withdrawn, contemplating escape or desertion. A few attempted suicide before the scheduled mission, trying to take control of their death timing. Mitsubishi, the 20-year-old with 30 flight hours, appeared at Yasui's quarters one evening in November. Mitsubishi was trembling. Mitsubishi requested permission to speak privately. Yasui granted the request. Mitsubishi explained that he had received orders for a kamikaze mission. Mitsubishi asked if there was any possibility of modification. Mitsubishi asked if there was any possibility of reassignment. Mitsubishi asked if there was any possibility of escape. Yasui told him there was not. Mitsubishi accepted this with formal military courtesy. But something in Mitsubishi's mental state had broken. Yasui recognized the signs. Mitsubishi was preparing for death, but not in the way Onishi envisioned. Mitsubishi was mentally fragmenting. Mitsubishi would pilot his aircraft toward the American fleet, but Mitsubishi would not reach it in a state of psychological coherence. Mitsubishi would crash, but Mitsubishi would do so as a man who had already died internally. The American Navy, meanwhile, was developing counter-tactics with increasing sophistication. Radar systems were improved to detect kamikaze aircraft earlier. Combat air patrols were expanded to intercept attacks at greater distance. Anti-aircraft battery fire patterns were modified based on analysis of kamikaze approaches. Ships were rearranged in formations that provided better mutual defense. The percentage of kamikaze aircraft destroyed before reaching targets increased from approximately 50% in October to approximately 70% by mid-November. But 70% destruction rate meant 30% success rate. And 30% of 100 aircraft represented 30 successful strikes against the American fleet. 30 strikes translated to damaged or destroyed ships. 30 strikes translated to sailors killed or wounded. The mathematics were still unfavorable for America. The American Navy could survive kamikaze attacks only if it developed defenses that approached near-perfect efficiency. And near-perfect efficiency was impossible to sustain indefinitely. Captain Robert Knott, analyzing the pattern of kamikaze attacks and American responses, understood the strategic dilemma. The Americans were winning the adaptation race, but only barely. If kamikaze attacks continued to increase in frequency, if Japanese could somehow improve pilot quality or aircraft reliability, the American defensive line could collapse. The Americans could lose more ships than they could replace with production. The Americans could sustain casualties at a rate that would undermine public support for the war. The Americans could be forced to negotiate a settlement that was less favorable than unconditional victory. But Knott also understood that this scenario assumed Japanese could sustain kamikaze operations indefinitely. In reality, Japan was running out of pilots. Japan was running out of aircraft. Japan was running out of fuel. Japan was running out of everything except the willingness to send young men to die. The kamikaze tactic was mathematically effective, but strategically limited by Japanese resource depletion. Onishi, understanding this time limitation, pushed for escalation. He wanted more pilots. He wanted more aircraft. He wanted more attacks per day. He wanted to overwhelm American defenses through sheer volume. But Japanese production could not match the escalation Onishi demanded. There were simply not enough pilots being trained. There were simply not enough aircraft being produced. There was simply not enough fuel to conduct the number of missions Onishi envisioned. So Onishi did the only thing he could do. He lowered training standards. Pilots with 20 hours of flight time were assigned to kamikaze missions. Pilots with barely any flight training were being hastily prepared. The quality of pilots declined, even as the quantity increased. This meant that newer pilots had lower accuracy. Newer pilots were more likely to be intercepted. Newer pilots were less likely to successfully reach their targets. But the sheer number of attacks compensated for individual pilot quality degradation. By late November, Yasui's units were receiving men with insufficient training. Yasui had to prepare these men for missions they were barely capable of executing. Mitsubishi, one of the poorly trained pilots, was assigned to a mission in late November. Yasui gave him final briefing. Yasui explained the target. Yasui explained the approach. Yasui explained what Mitsubishi should do when the anti-aircraft fire became intense. Yasui did not say, "You are probably going to be shot down before reaching the target." Yasui did not say, "Your training is insufficient and you likely will not survive." Yasui said, "Perform your duty with honor. Serve the Emperor. Accept your death with grace." Mitsubishi took off with 12 other pilots. The formation flew toward the American fleet. American radar detected them at long range. American combat air patrols intercepted them before reaching the fleet. Mitsubishi's aircraft was damaged. His engine was smoking. His control surfaces were damaged. But Mitsubishi continued flying. He continued descending toward the target. Anti-aircraft fire from the American ships was intense. Mitsubishi's aircraft was struck multiple times. The fuselage was torn with bullet holes, but Mitsubishi still flew downward, still aimed at the target. And then, at approximately 200 feet altitude, Mitsubishi's engine failed. The damaged aircraft could no longer sustain flight. Mitsubishi crashed into the ocean before reaching the American fleet. 13 pilots, 13 aircraft, 13 deaths. But no American ships were damaged. This became the pattern. As pilot quality declined, as training degraded, as desperation increased, the success rate of kamikaze attacks declined. More pilots died without reaching targets. More aircraft were intercepted. More missions achieved nothing except the expenditure of men and machines. The mathematics that had been so compelling in October, the idea that one aircraft could reliably destroy one ship, was becoming historical artifact rather than operational reality. By December 1944, the kamikaze tactic had achieved its peak effectiveness. From that point forward, American adaptation and Japanese resource degradation meant that the tactic's strategic value would decline. The window of maximum effectiveness had been brief, perhaps 6 weeks, from October through mid-November. During that window, kamikaze had cost the Americans significant casualties and significant ship losses. During that window, the tactic had seemed possibly transformative. During that window, there had been uncertainty about whether American naval power could continue to function under sustained kamikaze attack. But windows close, defenses improve, resources deplete. By December, it was clear that kamikaze, while still dangerous, would not fundamentally alter the course of the war. The Americans would continue advancing. The Americans would continue their island-hopping campaign. The Americans would eventually reach Japan itself. Kamikaze had delayed this process and inflicted costs along the way. But kamikaze had not prevented it. And this was the fundamental strategic failure of the tactic. Kamikaze could impose costs. Kamikaze could cause damage. Kamikaze could kill Americans. But kamikaze could not change the underlying strategic situation. Japan was still losing. Japan would continue to lose. And no amount of pilots willing to die could change this basic fact. The paradox of kamikaze was this: the tactic was statistically effective, but strategically ineffective. From October through November 1944, kamikaze attacks achieved approximately 40 to 50% success rate against American naval targets. This was extraordinarily high compared to conventional air attack effectiveness, which typically ranged from 5 to 15%. By pure mathematical analysis, kamikaze was 4 to 10 times more effective than conventional tactics. Yet, this exceptional tactical effectiveness did not translate into strategic success. The reasons were multiple and systemic. First, American production capacity was too great for kamikaze to destroy ships faster than America could build them. Second, American naval doctrine allowed for replacement of damaged ships and recovery from losses. Third, American strategic objectives did not depend on naval superiority alone, but on combined amphibious operations. Fourth, kamikaze could delay American progress, but not prevent it. Admiral Onishi began to recognize this strategic limitation by early December. The kamikaze attacks were still occurring, the pilots were still being sent to die, but the overall strategic situation had not fundamentally altered. The American fleet was still approaching Japanese home islands. The American army was still advancing. The American willingness to continue the war was not being broken by kamikaze attacks. If anything, the attacks were stiffening American resolve. This realization forced Onishi to confront a deeper problem. He had justified kamikaze on the basis that it would impose such high costs on Americans that Americans would eventually negotiate a peace settlement. But this assumption had been proven false. Americans were absorbing the costs. Americans were adapting to the threat. Americans were continuing their military operations. The pilots were dying. The aircraft were being destroyed. The ships were being damaged. And none of it was achieving the strategic objective that Onishi had promised. Yasui, overseeing increasingly desperate kamikaze operations in December and January, began to understand the tragedy of what was occurring. He was sending young men to die for a tactic that was not achieving its strategic purpose. He was ordering suicides that were not changing the war's outcome. He was destroying trained pilots and irreplaceable aircraft for damage that was minor compared to American production capacity. The honor and sacrifice that Onishi spoke of had become, in Yasui's mind, merely waste. Waste of young lives, waste of military resources, waste of Japan's remaining capability. But Yasui could not say this. Yasui could not question Onishi's orders. Yasui could not suggest that the Kamikaze strategy was futile. Yasui could only continue executing the orders, continue sending pilots to die, continue briefing men on their final missions, continue observing the ritual preparations, continue witnessing death. The American Navy, meanwhile, had reached near-complete adaptation to kamikaze tactics by January 1945. Anti-aircraft systems had been refined. Radar coverage was comprehensive. Combat air patrols were extensive. New tactics for intercepting kamikaze aircraft had been developed and implemented across the fleet. The destruction rate of kamikaze aircraft increased to approximately 80 to 85%. Only 15 to 20% were reaching American ships, and of those reaching ships, many were being destroyed by near-miss explosions or were striking non-vital areas. The mathematics had reversed. The tactic that had seemed so promising in October was becoming increasingly ineffective by January. Japanese pilots were still dying in large numbers, but the return on these deaths, in terms of American ships damaged or destroyed, had declined dramatically. The ratio that had been 10-1 in Japan's favor in October was becoming 1-10 against Japan by January. Captain Robert Knott, analyzing the kamikaze attacks through January 1945, was struck by the transformation. What had seemed like a genuine threat to American naval operations in October had become a manageable tactical problem by January. The Americans had adapted. The Americans had maintained operational tempo. The Americans were preparing for the final assault on Japanese home islands, and the kamikaze, for all their sacrifice, had not prevented this preparation. But Knott also recognized something else. The kamikaze had cost American lives. The USS St. was gone. Other ships were damaged or sunk. American sailors were dead. American families were grieving. The kamikaze had imposed real costs. The kamikaze had caused real suffering. The kamikaze had demonstrated that even a defeated enemy, if sufficiently desperate, could impose significant casualties. The victory would come, but it would not be costless. Onishi, by early February 1945, had exhausted the pilot pool that could be reliably used for kamikaze operations. The training standards had been reduced to the point where new pilots were barely capable of piloting aircraft, much less conducting precise attacks. The aircraft themselves were becoming harder to obtain. Fuel was scarce. The entire Japanese military apparatus was beginning to collapse under American pressure. Onishi made a decision that would haunt him for the remainder of his life. He authorized expanded kamikaze recruitment. Instead of volunteers and previously trained pilots, Onishi began ordering conscripted soldiers with no flight training to undergo rapid instruction and then conduct kamikaze missions. Young men with perhaps 10 hours of flight training were being sent on one-way missions. Young men who had never been pilots were being forced into aircraft. The quality of pilots declined to the point where mission success rates became negligible. But Onishi continued anyway, because continuing was all that remained. Yasui, receiving orders to train and deploy pilots with minimal qualifications, finally experienced what might be described as moral breakdown. He had prepared to send volunteers and trained pilots to their deaths. He had prepared to send conscripted soldiers to their deaths. But sending men with minimal flight training, men who had never chosen military service, men who barely understood what was being done to them, this was something different. This was not honor. This was not sacrifice. This was murder. Yasui attempted to resign from his position in February 1945. Onishi refused to accept the resignation. Yasui was told his duty was to continue. Yasui was told that desertion would result in execution. Yasui was told that his personal feelings were irrelevant compared to the emperor's needs. Yasui continued. He continued preparing pilots for death. He continued briefing men on their final missions. He continued participating in a system that had become, by his own recognition, profoundly immoral. The final weeks of the Kamikaze campaign, from February through August 1945, were characterized by increasing desperation and decreasing effectiveness. Missions were launched with aircraft that were barely flyable. Pilots were sent with training that was barely adequate. Fuel was being rationed to dangerous levels. The anti-aircraft defense systems were being disabled due to ammunition shortages. The entire operation had become symbolic rather than strategic. Japan was not fighting to win. Japan was fighting to demonstrate that it would fight to the end. Japan was fighting to show American decision-makers that defeating Japan would be costly. Japan was fighting for terms rather than victory. By August 1945, when atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and when Japan finally surrendered, the Kamikaze campaign had expended approximately 4,000 pilots. Approximately 3,000 had been killed in combat or accidents. Several hundred had survived to the war's end. The results of these sacrifices: approximately 60 ships damaged or destroyed, approximately 10,000 American military personnel killed or wounded. The cost-benefit analysis was stark. 4,000 pilots, years of training, irreplaceable expertise, young men, had been expended to inflict damage that, while significant, had not achieved the strategic objective of forcing American negotiation. Kamikaze had been a tactic born of desperation. Kamikaze had been theoretically brilliant, a way to convert pilots who might die anyway into weapons that could guarantee damage to the enemy. But Kamikaze had become a symbol of Japan's defeat, rather than a tool of victory. Kamikaze had demonstrated that, even when an enemy was willing to die, when an entire military apparatus was willing to sacrifice its young men, strategy still mattered more than courage. And Japan's strategy had been fundamentally flawed from the moment Onishi conceived it. August 15, 1945. Japan surrendered. Emperor Hirohito announced the capitulation in a radio broadcast. The Pacific War was over. The Kamikaze operations ceased. No more pilots would be sent to their deaths. No more aircraft would be converted into weapons of suicide. The tactic that Admiral Onishi had conceived as Japan's final answer to American military superiority had ended not in triumph, but in extinction. Admiral Onishi received the news of Japan's surrender with profound shock. Onishi had believed, or had convinced himself, that kamikaze operations would eventually force Americans to negotiate. Onishi had believed that the costs of invading Japan would be so high that Americans would seek a peace settlement. Onishi had believed that suicide could achieve what strategy could not. But the surrender meant that Onishi had been wrong. The suicide had accomplished nothing except the deaths of thousands of young men. Onishi attempted to make sense of this failure through one final act. On September 10, 1945, less than a month after Japan's surrender, Admiral Takijiro Onishi performed seppuku, ritual suicide. Onishi wrote farewell letters. Onishi acknowledged that the kamikaze strategy had failed. Onishi accepted responsibility for the deaths of the pilots he had ordered to die. And then, Onishi took a blade and ended his own life. The man who had conceived of kamikaze as a path to honor had died by his own hand, having found no honor in what he had created. Major Masaru Yasui survived the war. Yasui was interrogated by American military authorities regarding his role in kamikaze operations. Yasui provided detailed accounts of how the kamikaze program had evolved, how pilot quality had declined, how desperate the final operations had become. Yasui described sending men to die in aircraft that were barely flyable. Yasui described ordering soldiers with minimal training to conduct suicide missions. Yasui described the psychological and moral deterioration of the program as it continued into its final months. When asked by American interrogators if he believed the kamikaze operations had been justified, Yasui responded with a reflection that would become historically significant. Yasui said, "We believed we were sacrificing for honor. We believed we were serving the emperor. We believed we were demonstrating Japanese resolve. But what we were actually doing was wasting lives. We were destroying thousands of young men to inflict damage that did not change the war's outcome. We were using suicide as a military tactic, when suicide can never be a military tactic. Military tactics should achieve military objectives. Suicide achieves only death. We achieved death very efficiently. We achieved military objectives not at all." Captain Robert Knott, reviewing the final casualty statistics of the kamikaze campaign after the war, was struck by the fundamental asymmetry. 4,000 Japanese pilots had died. Approximately 10,000 American military personnel had been killed or wounded. Approximately 60 American ships had been damaged or destroyed. By any rational calculation, the Americans had lost strategically significant numbers of sailors and ships. Yet the Americans had won the war. The Americans had forced Japan's surrender. The Americans had achieved their strategic objectives despite the kamikaze campaign's costs. This raised a question that military theorists would debate for decades. If kamikaze had been strategically successful, what would it have looked like? If kamikaze had achieved its intended objective of forcing American negotiation, what would that negotiated settlement have included? The historical record provided no answer to these questions, because kamikaze had failed. The tactic had been mathematically effective, but strategically insufficient. Tactical effectiveness had not translated into strategic success. The post-war analysis of kamikaze operations revealed something even more fundamental. The vast majority of kamikaze pilots were young men, between 18 and 25 years old. Many had been conscripted. Many had been given minimal training. Many had expressed fear or reluctance about the missions they were being ordered to perform. The mythology of kamikaze, that they were volunteers inspired by fanatical devotion to the emperor, was only partially true. Many kamikaze pilots were coerced into participation. Many were mentally unprepared. Many were simply following orders because the alternative was military execution or social ostracism. Mitsubishi, the young pilot with minimal training, had survived the war. Mitsubishi had crashed into the ocean before reaching his designated target, his aircraft damaged by anti-aircraft fire. Mitsubishi had survived the impact. Mitsubishi had been rescued by Japanese naval personnel and returned to his base. Mitsubishi survived the war and lived until 1998. In his final years, Mitsubishi gave interviews describing his experience as a kamikaze pilot. He described the terror of knowing he had been ordered to die. He described the psychological relief when his aircraft crashed and he survived. He described the guilt of surviving when other pilots had not. Mitsubishi's testimony became part of the historical record, the voice of a man who had been ordered to commit suicide and who had survived to tell the story. American military planners, analyzing the kamikaze campaign after the war, reached conclusions that would influence military doctrine for decades. First, suicidal tactics were not a reliable method of achieving strategic objectives. Second, adaptation and defense could significantly reduce the effectiveness of even innovative tactics. Third, tactical innovations could not overcome underlying strategic disadvantages. Fourth, the psychological and physical costs of suicide attacks on defenders should not be underestimated, even if the attacks failed to achieve their strategic purpose. These conclusions influenced American military thinking about future threats. When suicide bombing became a recurring tactic in late 20th century conflicts, from terrorism to insurgency warfare, military theorists drew parallels to kamikaze operations. The mathematics of suicide attacks were similar. An attacker willing to die could achieve high probability of reaching a target, but the strategic effectiveness of such attacks depended on whether the defender was unwilling to adapt, or whether the attacks could cause sufficient cumulative damage to achieve political objectives. American military doctrine evolved to account for suicide attack threats, but the fundamental lesson remained the same. Suicide could be tactically effective, but strategically limited. The Japanese military, analyzing kamikaze operations in the post-war period, reached similar but more painful conclusions. Japan had expended thousands of young men to inflict damage that did not change the war's outcome. Japan had created a culture of suicide that had degraded morale and demonstrated desperation rather than strength. Japan had proven not that suicide was an effective tactic, but that military defeat leads to military desperation. Japan's post-war military doctrine would explicitly reject kamikaze-style tactics, recognizing that such tactics represented the breakdown of rational military strategy rather than its apotheosis. The memorial sites created at Yasukuni Shrine and other locations throughout Japan honored the kamikaze pilots as war dead. The historical narrative that developed portrayed them as honorable warriors who had sacrificed for their nation. But the more complete historical record, based on interviews with survivors, analysis of military documents, and accounts from those who had ordered the operations, revealed a more complex reality. The kamikaze pilots included volunteers who genuinely believed in their cause, but also conscripted soldiers who had been ordered to die, young men with inadequate training who had been sent on suicide missions out of desperation, pilots whose deaths had not achieved the strategic purpose that was claimed for them. The paradox of kamikaze was this: the tactic had been born from military desperation and had ended in military failure. Yet it had been transformed into a symbol of honor and sacrifice. The pilots who had actually performed the missions, many of whom had expressed fear or reluctance, were memorialized as heroic martyrs. The officers who had ordered the missions, including Onishi himself, who had ultimately accepted responsibility through suicide, were portrayed as strategists attempting to save their nation. But the historical analysis revealed something darker. A military machine that, facing inevitable defeat, had converted thousands of young men into weapons, had claimed honor for suicide, and had achieved nothing except an expansion of death. The kamikaze campaign lasted approximately 10 months, from October 1944 to August 1945. During this time, approximately 4,000 pilots were expended. The results were measurable but insufficient to change the war's outcome. The American Navy suffered significant damage. American sailors were killed. American ships were destroyed or damaged. But American production continued. American strategy continued. American military operations continued. And Japan was defeated, regardless of the kamikaze campaign's costs to the Americans. This was the ultimate truth that kamikaze revealed: that tactical innovation could not overcome strategic disadvantage, that willingness to die could not overcome industrial production capacity, that courage could not overcome numbers, that desperation could not overcome inevitability. The kamikaze campaign had demonstrated not the potential for suicide as a military tactic, but rather the limitation of any tactic when deployed by a militarily defeated nation facing a militarily superior opponent. Kamikaze had been an anomaly, a moment when a defeated military had attempted to create a new calculus through sacrifice. But the new calculus had not worked. The old calculus, of production, of numbers, of industrial capacity, had proven decisive. The historical reckoning with Kamikaze began immediately after Japan's surrender and continued through decades of analysis. Western military scholars studied the operation to understand what it revealed about warfare, psychology, and the limits of tactical innovation. Japanese scholars conducted similar analysis, attempting to understand how their nation had reached the point of ordering soldiers to commit suicide as military tactic. The conclusions reached by scholars across all perspectives converged on a fundamental truth. Kamikaze represented not the apotheosis of military strategy, but rather its complete failure. The historiographical treatment of Kamikaze evolved dramatically from the war's end through the present day. In the immediate post-war period, particularly in Western accounts, Kamikaze pilots were often portrayed as fanatical Japanese militarists, men consumed by emperor worship and willing to die for imperial glory. This narrative was politically useful to Western nations attempting to justify the atomic bombings and the harsh occupation of Japan. It portrayed Japanese culture as fundamentally alien and dangerous. It portrayed Kamikaze as evidence of Japanese irrationality and fanaticism. But, as decades passed, as interviews were conducted with survivors, as documents were declassified and analyzed, a more complex picture emerged. Many Kamikaze pilots had been conscripted. Many had been given minimal training. Many had expressed fear or reluctance about their missions. Many had been young men simply following military orders in a culture where disobedience meant execution or social death. The mythology of the willing martyr gave way to a more nuanced understanding of coercion, desperation, and the psychological mechanisms through which military institutions convince young men to accept their own deaths. Contemporary scholarship on Kamikaze focuses on several key themes. First, the tactic's origins in desperation rather than ideology. Kamikaze was not conceived as an expression of Japanese spiritual superiority, but as a pragmatic response to Japanese military inferiority. When conventional tactics failed, when strategy failed, when innovation failed, desperation produced Kamikaze. Second, the tactic's fundamental incompatibility with rational military strategy. Kamikaze could impose costs on enemies. Kamikaze could cause damage. But Kamikaze could not achieve political objectives. Kamikaze could not force negotiation. Kamikaze could not change the underlying strategic situation. Third, the psychological mechanisms through which military institutions normalized suicide, ritual, ideology, peer pressure, coercion, and institutional authority, all combined to make suicide seem acceptable, even honorable, within the context of military service. The post-war American military incorporated lessons from Kamikaze into doctrine regarding future threats. Military planners recognized that suicide attacks would likely recur when defenders possessed overwhelming conventional military superiority. Military strategists understood that adaptation could reduce the effectiveness of suicide attacks, but could never eliminate them entirely. Military theorists recognized that defending against suicide attacks required psychological as well as physical preparation. American military doctrine evolved to account for threats that violated the assumption that adversaries wanted to survive. The post-war Japanese military reached the opposite conclusion. Having experienced the catastrophic failure of Kamikaze as military tactic, post-war Japanese military doctrine explicitly rejected suicide attacks as valid military strategy. The self-defense force, established during the American occupation of Japan, was based on conventional military principles, emphasizing survival of military personnel and achievement of military objectives through means other than suicide. Japan's post-war military evolution represented a conscious rejection of the assumptions that had produced kamikaze. The psychological impact of kamikaze on American Navy personnel extended far beyond the war's end. American sailors who had served aboard ships damaged or nearly destroyed by kamikaze attacks carried psychological trauma for the rest of their lives. Many developed what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. The experience of facing attackers who were not attempting to escape, who were not attempting to preserve their own lives, created a unique psychological challenge. Conventional warfare assumes mutual interest in survival. Kamikaze violated this assumption. American sailors found themselves unable to comprehend an enemy that had already accepted death as inevitable. The American sailors who survived kamikaze attacks often developed complex emotions regarding their attackers. Some felt anger and hatred. Some felt pity for the young men who had been forced into suicide missions. Some felt philosophical curiosity about what motivated men to accept their own deaths. The kamikaze pilots, from the American perspective, were neither simply villains nor simply victims. They were something more complex. Men caught between military orders, cultural pressure, ideological framing, and the basic human desire to survive. The legacy of kamikaze extended far beyond the Second World War. When suicide bombing emerged as a tactic in late 20th century conflicts, from the Middle East to South Asia to Europe, military analysts and scholars drew historical parallels to kamikaze operations. The mathematics of suicide attacks were similar. An attacker willing to die possessed tactical advantages over defenders, but the strategic limitations remained the same. Suicide attacks could impose costs on defenders. Suicide attacks could cause casualties. Suicide attacks could damage infrastructure. But suicide attacks had never successfully achieved the political objectives that motivated them. The failure of kamikaze to force American negotiation prefigured the failure of later suicide attack campaigns to achieve their stated political goals. Contemporary terrorism studies incorporate analysis of kamikaze as a historical precedent for understanding suicide attacks. Scholars note that kamikaze pilots, like contemporary suicide attackers, were often motivated by a mixture of genuine ideological commitment and coercion. Young men who might not have volunteered for suicide missions under normal circumstances found themselves psychologically unable to refuse when orders came and when cultural and institutional pressure was applied. The choice to participate in suicide missions was often not a genuine choice, but rather the least bad option in a constrained set of possibilities. Military historians studying kamikaze have reached consensus that the tactic represents an anomaly in military history, a moment when a militarily defeated nation attempted to create a new calculus through sacrifice. But the new calculus did not work. The old calculus of production, numbers, and industrial capacity proved decisive. This conclusion has influenced military thinking about future conflicts. Military planners recognize that asymmetric tactics deployed by weaker military powers might impose costs on stronger powers, but that asymmetric tactics cannot overcome underlying power imbalances. The final assessment of kamikaze must be this: the tactic was tactically significant, but strategically insignificant. Kamikaze inflicted real damage. Kamikaze killed American sailors. Kamikaze destroyed American ships. Kamikaze imposed psychological stress on American military personnel. But kamikaze did not change the war's outcome. Kamikaze did not force American negotiation. Kamikaze did not delay American victory significantly. Kamikaze accomplished only one clear objective: the deaths of approximately 4,000 Japanese pilots, and the expansion of human suffering on both sides of the conflict. The memorial to kamikaze pilots at Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo honors the dead with ceremony and reverence. The inscription honors their sacrifice and their service to the emperor. But the historical record beneath the ceremony tells a different story. The story is not of heroic sacrifice achieving political objectives. The story is of young men sent to die in a last-ditch attempt to change the unchangeable. The story is of military desperation disguised as honor. The story is of institutional failure masquerading as spiritual transcendence. The story is that when military strategy fails, when military technology fails, when military personnel are insufficient, no amount of willingness to die can restore success. Yasui lived until 1982, spending the final decades of his life contemplating his role in the kamikaze program. In interviews conducted near the end of his life, Yasui reflected that the greatest tragedy was not that kamikaze had failed militarily, but that kamikaze had represented a failure of Japanese leadership to acknowledge reality. If Japanese leadership had accepted that the war was lost in 1944, if Japanese commanders had pursued negotiated settlement, if Japanese military had ceased futile operations, thousands of lives could have been saved. Instead, Japanese leadership had pursued kamikaze, not because kamikaze offered hope of victory, but because kamikaze allowed military leaders to deny the reality of defeat. This was perhaps the deepest lesson of kamikaze, that military institutions, when facing inevitable defeat, often respond not by adapting to reality, but by escalating desperation. Military leaders, unable to accept failure, often commit additional resources to failing strategies. Military organizations, facing defeat, often turn increasingly to coercion of their own personnel. The human cost of this dynamic, the young men sent to die in last-ditch attempts that everyone involved knows will fail, becomes the final casualty of warfare. Kamikaze represented not the triumph of the human spirit, but rather the capacity of institutions to consume human life in pursuit of objectives that are already impossible to achieve. The enduring significance of kamikaze is that it stands as historical monument to the limits of human sacrifice. It demonstrates that willingness to die, while psychologically impressive, cannot overcome material disadvantage. It demonstrates that courage, while admirable, cannot substitute for strategy. It demonstrates that ritual and ideology, while psychologically powerful, cannot change physical reality. Kamikaze failed not because Japanese pilots lacked courage or commitment, but because tactical innovation cannot overcome strategic defeat. The pilots who died in kamikaze operations deserved better than to be used as instruments of military failure. They deserved a military leadership willing to accept reality and seek peace. Instead, they received ritual, ideology, and orders to die. The legacy of kamikaze is not honor, but rather a cautionary tale about what happens when military institutions fail to adapt to changing reality.